Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief. On today's program, we'll be talking about Turkey. The year 2023 marks the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And we'll be discussing where things stand today. We'll also be covering the political landscape in the aftermath of the May 2023 elections, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's push for constitutional change, and how Turkey is dealing with key foreign policy issues like the Israel-Hamas war, Sweden's NATO membership bid, and relations with the U.S. For all the Turkey watchers out there, I should also note that MEI's Turkish Studies program will be hosting its 12th annual Turkey conference on December 6th at the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. It'll be a full day of insightful and timely conversations about how Turkey's identity has changed over the last 100 years, the health of its democracy, the evolving direction of its foreign and regional policies, as well as its relationship with the U.S. For more information and to register, please visit the MEI website at www.mei.edu. To help make sense of the big picture and the latest developments in Turkey, I'm delighted to be joined today by Gönül Toll, Senior Fellow and the Founding Director of MEI's Turkish Studies program. Gönül, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Alistair.
Gönül, as I mentioned at the top of the program, this year marks the centenary of the establishment of the Turkish Republic. Before we delve into the latest developments, can you give our listeners a sort of brief snapshot of Turkey at 100? Where do things stand today?
Well, one of the defining features of Turkish politics since 1923, since the inception of modern Turkey, Alistair, it's been its lack of liberal democracy. If you take minimalist definitions of democracy, one might argue that Turkey before Erdogan was an illiberal democracy where free and fair elections took place. Courts were not entirely independent, but aside from the two red lines of the secularist establishment, namely Islamism and Kurdish separatism, courts pretty much functioned properly. There were strong institutions. The media environment was very lively. Journalists could ask tough questions to governments. Opposition parties were able to get their message across. The political competition was real. The secularists' fear of Islamism and Kurdish separatism were the two limitations on the functioning of democracy. Then came Erdogan. His initial years in power saw an opening in the political system. Those were hopeful years. He carried out several important reforms to get Turkey into EU. But even without those reforms, the optics of a Turkish prime minister whose wife wears the headscarf in itself was liberating to millions of people. And I thought it was great news for Turkish democracy in general. On the Kurdish question, too, Erdogan sounded like he was going to open a new chapter, one that recognized the Kurdish issue as a matter of human rights, not just as a terrorism problem, as had been done for decades. Now, 21 years after Erdogan came to power and 100 years after the inception of modern Turkey, following Turkish politics has never been more depressing. Erdogan came to power promising to make Turkish democracy better. Instead, he took an illiberal democracy and turned it into autocracy. He destroyed the country's institutions to centralize power in his hands, and except for a few independent outlets, Turkish media today is entirely under Erdogan's control. Courts are again under his control. One can land in jail for simply liking a post on Facebook or Twitter criticizing Erdogan. So one man calls the shots in a country of 85 million in every aspect of life, from politics to arts and sports and anything you can imagine. One rare positive development is that fear of Islam in the public sphere that had derailed Turkish democracy for decades before Erdogan came to power is resolved now. Women freely wear their hijabs, headscarves everywhere, but fear of Kurdish separatism is still there. And it helped Erdogan establish his one man rule. So Turkey was once considered one of the most hopeful cases in the Middle East for democratic consolidation, and it's no more.
I think you've provided a great overview there, and I want to turn now to delve into the current domestic political situation in more detail. Despite considerable optimism about the opposition's prospects in the run up to the May 2023 general elections, in the end, President Erdogan won re election and his People's Alliance secured a majority in parliament. Where does the opposition find itself now, kind of 6 months on from that election?
Well, the main opposition party, the CHP, picked a new leader for itself. And I think that's in itself is a welcome development. And that is independent of how the new leader might perform. Because after the elections, I think the most dangerous development, aside from the fact that an autocrat won elections again, but the other very depressing development was seeing opposition supporters retreating into a very apolitical space where I saw them, they had given up on hope on democracy. I traveled to Turkey after the elections and I talked to people, and I realized that even those who were once very active in politics, who were actively following the developments in the country, they had resigned themselves to a new reality where they thought changing power peacefully is not possible anymore in Erdogan's Turkey. He is going to be there forever. He's never going to lose an election. So that was the sentiment. And that is very dangerous because if you have almost half of the population, and let's remember 47, 48% was captured by the opposition candidates. So the country is divided in half. So half of the population thinks that, there's no democracy and it doesn't even matter. Elections won't even matter. That is a very dangerous development. People losing hope and faith in the democratic process is very dangerous. And Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the CHP's leader, who led the entire process, and he was also the opposition's candidate, his refusal to resign after he lost the elections, I think, fed that pessimism among opposition supporters. So that's why I always argued that Kılıçdaroğlu, the least he can do for the prospects of a democratic future is to resign. And he did not do that. And finally, in his party's Congress, the party members elected a new leader. So I think that is a positive development. Özgür Özel, the new leader, is different from Kılıçdaroğlu in many ways. He's younger, he represents the young generation in some sense. He's a fiery figure. So he's different. But I don't know what might become of him or where he might take the party to, which direction he's going to take. I don't know right now. But just the fact that the opposition is now has a new leader and that leader emerged from a democratic process is in itself really good news. And I think it really boosts the morale of opposition supporters.
I think that's an essential point just because Turkish political parties have such a kind of terrible track record of internal democracy. And certainly thinking about Kılıçdaroğlu's predecessor, Deniz Baykal, it took him ages and ages and ages to finally be unseated. So I think that's a really important point and just really worth emphasizing. We obviously touched on the Republican People's Party, the CHP. I wanted to turn to the other major opposition party, the Good Party or E Party, which has been in turmoil itself lately, hit by a string of resignations, corruption allegations. What's going on there?
Well, it's in disarray, Alistair. Some people really expected this to happen. The argument was if the opposition loses the upcoming elections, then we're going to be seeing this soul searching within each opposition party. The CHP main opposition has gone through its own, and a new leader emerged from that process. And now the other very critical opposition party is the Good Party. Now it's going through the same. So the question is what will emerge from that? What's happening in E-Party is not really soul searching. I think on many issues it stands right where it used to. And the prospects of a new leader there is not possible because Good Party is an interesting phenomenon. It's broke away from the Nationalist Party. So one might argue that it's an entire new party, but on the other hand, in terms of cadre and also where it stands on ideological things and Turkey's major problems, it's not that different. There are obviously differences, but I think what brought E-Party to life was nationalist anti-Erdogan stance. So that hasn't changed. But a lot going on in the party. And I think the main reason is that because the party lost the elections. And again, ideologically, they're not that different from Erdogan's allies. So, looking at other opposition parties in the opposition coalition, you might think that Good Party is, from an ideological point of view, won't have that much problem with the Erdogan regime. Obviously, the base who supports Good Party, they are against Erdogan, and that's what differentiates them from MHP, which is the traditional far right party that's allied with Erdogan. If there is going to be a kind of alliance between some members of Good Party, and I think that's what's exactly happening. Some people from Good Party are joining the AKP, some going back to MHP. So I think what we're seeing is not really important in terms of addressing the question of what's going to happen to the country's democratic prospects. So that's why I don't find the current turmoil in the party as a healthy turmoil from a democratic point of view, but it just creates more disarray in an opposition that already looks in trouble.
So some positive signs certainly within CHP in terms of its election of a new leader, but to your mind, kind of worrying turmoil, non-productive turmoil, more infighting, score settling, that sort of thing within the Good Party.
Right, that's exactly right.
I want to turn to the issue of the Turkish judiciary, which has been in a state of chaos itself lately, given a potential constitutional crisis sparked by a dispute between the Court of Cassation and the Constitutional Court. I know this sounds a little bit in the weeds, but it's important. How serious is this dispute, and what do you think it tells us kind of more broadly about judicial independence and the rule of law in Turkey in 2023?
Well, I wish we could speak about the judicial independence in Erdogan's Turkey. That's not the case. I mean, courts are largely controlled by Erdogan. And the dispute that we've seen is, although it's, again, from a political democratic point of view, liberal point of view, I think it's a healthy dispute. But on the other hand, it could pave the way for a more troubling development for Turkey's future. And that is this infighting between high courts could paved the way for what Erdogan's close ally, Devlet Bahçeli, who is the leader of the far right party, has been calling for a long time. He has always been very critical of the Constitutional Court, the highest court that deals with human rights in the country. He even suggested that the court is shut down. So, this new debate between two high courts rekindled the debate where some on the MHP front are suggesting that, Devlet Bahçeli has been right. This court should be shut down. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. But this just opened the way for a new discussion. And Erdogan stepped in, and this whole new debate about the conflict between the courts could provide an opportunity for Erdogan to call for a new constitution. And he has done that. He's been calling for a new constitution, for a more democratic constitution, although we've done this already in 2010, 2011, a referendum with restructuring of the courts, several amendments to the constitution. So we've done that already. But Erdogan is now calling for drafting a civilian constitution. And I'm afraid what he has in mind has nothing to do with a democratic vision. What he might have in mind is drafting a constitution which identifies Turkish nation as a Sunni Muslim nation. This is Erdogan's legacy time, which means that he really wants to undo some aspects of Atatürk's legacy. And drafting a new constitution which has that kind of language could be what he has in mind. And I'm not talking about the prospect of removing the secularism clause altogether. That would be way too controversial, even for Erdogan. But just inject some language there that will redefine the Turkish nation and just highlight the Islamic credentials of the nation. So, to sum up, this debate about the conflict between the courts could lead the way for that, for Erdogan's vision and legacy.
Although interestingly, one of the kind of first figures to come out publicly against Erdogan's suggestion of this change in the potential majority for electing the president was his coalition partner, Devlet Bahçeli, the head of the MHP. How significant do you think that split is, and what does that tell us about the relationship between the two leaders?
Well, with regards to the relation between the two leaders, Devlet Bahçeli is following Turkish politics very closely on a daily basis. I hear this very often. Some people are very critical of Devlet Bahçeli, saying that, this man, he's very old, his health is not in great condition. Sometimes, I mean, you can't even understand what he says when he speaks. He speaks in a really strange way. So people criticize him. But in fact, if you look at what he's done with his party and with his base and with the entire Turkish state, one might think that is actually brilliant. Because thanks to that alliance that he cultivated with Erdogan, he bears no responsibility whatsoever for government's failures, right? Because he's not formally part of the government. But on the other hand, Turkish bureaucracy is stuffed with MHP loyalists, especially the security bureaucracy. And also, he has huge veto power over anything that Erdogan does. He makes the final decisions. Devlet Bahçeli holds so much sway, and without his buy-in, it's going to be almost impossible for Erdogan to do anything. But what does that public disagreement mean? I think from Erdogan's point of view, it's understandable because he doesn't want anyone to have veto power over him. But on the other hand, he has been losing ground domestically. In the polls, yes, he keeps winning elections. They're certainly not fair, but I have doubts about then elections being free as well. But still, he wins elections. He has enough majority. And it's all thanks to that alliance with Devlet Bahçeli. Could that public rift lead to a breakup? I doubt it because Erdogan cannot afford that breakup, and Devlet Bahçeli has no reason to break up with Erdogan.
Speaking of elections, the next major event on the Turkish political calendar is the March 2024 local elections. The key races there will be for control of the mayorships of Ankara and Istanbul, Turkey's political and economic capitals, both of which are currently in opposition hands. The two cities' mayors, Mansur Yavaş and Ekrem İmamoğlu, are both among the opposition's most popular figures. How do you view those races 4 months out? And do you think we're likely to see another opposition electoral alliance, especially between the CHP and an EE party?
Today, E-Party leader Meral Akşener and CHP's new leader Özgür Özel had a meeting, and everyone was really waiting for that meeting. It's a very critical meeting. The number one agenda item was going to be that very question, Alistair, you just posed. Initially, before this meeting, good party officials, after the elections in May, had always suggested that their party was going to field their own candidate. So there was not going to be an alliance, an electoral alliance with the opposition, and they said that they wanted to field their candidates in all of the 81 provinces. I find that very troubling for the CHP and the opposition hold over especially big cities like Istanbul and Ankara. So that's why I myself was pretty much looking forward to today's meeting between the two leaders. They came out and said, Meral Akşener underlined that decision to field their own candidate still holds, but she wants to talk to her party members first on Monday. So now the next critical meeting is that one, I think. Especially, I think Ankara and Istanbul holding those opposition hold over those cities are extremely important, just both for the opposition and for Erdogan. So that's why Erdogan already launched the election campaign saying that we want Istanbul and Ankara back. And particularly Istanbul is very important for him, not just for emotional reasons. It's the place that he launched his political career, but also from a very pragmatic point of view. Istanbul served as this great pool, financial pool that fed Erdogan's clientelistic network for many, many years. So, as a revenue source, Istanbul is important for Erdogan regime's stability and Ankara as well. So I think that's why he's going to do everything in his power to take those cities back. The question is, can he do that? Obviously, the answer to that question depends on first how people in general view Ekrem İmamoğlu's tenure as Istanbul mayor. I think he's been a good mayor, and the Kurdish vote, nationalist vote, really helped him a lot to win the elections in Istanbul twice, if you remember. So, are those votes still there? I think Kurds would back him. The question is, what will good party do? Without a good party's support, it might be a little difficult for Ekrem İmamoğlu. And of course, it also depends on who Erdogan is going to feel for Istanbul. Now, several names are being circulated, nothing for certain yet. In Ankara too, Mansur Yavaş, he is, I think, he has a better standing because when he was elected mayor of Ankara, he captured votes not just from the CHP's base, but also from the nationalists. And it's easy, it's natural for him to appeal to the nationalists, having come from a nationalist background. So even, I guess, without good party's endorsement, he could still do well. But again, going back to the original point, it's extremely important for CHP and good party to form an alliance, especially in these two big cities, for them to stand a chance against the ruling alliance candidate.
We've covered the domestic political landscape in a fair bit of detail here, but I want to move on and touch on some of the foreign policy issues, because there's obviously a number of major ones that Turkey is involved with at the moment. First and foremost, of course, is the war in Gaza, which has led to a sharp decline in relations between Turkey and Israel amid increasingly heated rhetoric from President Erdogan. How is Turkey approaching the crisis? And in your view, is there any role for it to play in negotiations over issues like extending the ceasefire, facilitating hostage or prisoner release, and ultimately bringing the conflict to an end?
Well, the prospects for a role for Erdogan in this crisis has evolved, I think. Initially, right after October 7th, Erdogan came out and issued a very measured statement, which was somewhat surprising, but in other ways it wasn't surprising because, it was surprising because he's a man who just, who says things, who says dramatic things, who surprises people. But on the other hand, he's a very pragmatic leader and he has been trying to mend ties with everyone, with the West, with Washington, with European countries, with regional countries, Egypt, Israel, everyone. So, in that sense, it was not surprising to hear Erdogan in this very measured tone on a topic that is very close to his heart. Looking at it from Turkey's point of view, I thought it was a good statement. And yet, shortly after that statement, Erdogan said things that were dramatically different from that measured tone, initial measured tone. He said things like Hamas is not a terrorist organization. And, Israeli state is Netanyahu has become a war criminal, things like that. So now you can say those things and you can make those assertions. And from a moral point of view, on some of those things, you might be right. But if you want to play a role in the resolution of that conflict, the minute you say those things, your prospects become dimmer, right? That's why, a country like Qatar, for instance, has led the diplomatic effort. Qatar has this a very unique relationship with the warring parties. On the one hand, it's hosting Hamas's top leadership. On the other, it's providing the financial aid to people in Gaza. So its standing vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue is very strong. On the other hand, although Qatar is not one of the countries that basically initially said that I'm very open to normalizing ties with Israel, like other Gulf countries had done. But on the other, from a historical point of view, it has this unique relationship with Israel, which made Qatar a unique player among the Gulf countries. So Qatar played its hand really wisely And that's why I think it became this shining actor in the conflict, whereas Turkey became a marginal actor in the conflict. And part of that is, again, this very fiery rhetoric. And the other one is regional actors don't really trust Erdogan, especially those who has seen in Erdogan a supporter of Islamists and in some cases supporter of jihadi organizations. So despite Erdogan's normalization efforts with Israel and Saudis and Egyptians and everyone else, still these regimes look at Erdogan as someone who is not credible enough to mediate in a crisis like this one. And the second aspect of the problem is, of course, here in Washington, we often talk about how close Erdogan has been to Hamas, and he has been close to Hamas. But in the last few years, that relationship has been downgraded by Erdogan, mainly because he wanted to mend ties with regional countries, and that was one of the conditions set forth by these actors. So there's still Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas networks in Istanbul, but they're not as visible as they were before. So that's why here we have Turkey that is viewed by the Israeli side as not a credible partner. And then you have a Turkey that does not have a stronger relationship with Hamas. So that's why I think Turkey could not play the role that it wanted to play in the current crisis between Palestinians and Israel.
Closer to home here in Washington, we've also been dealing with this kind of long running saga over Turkish approval of Sweden's NATO accession and the linked issue of US F 16 sales to Turkey, which requires congressional sign off. That's been a big stumbling block to the approval of the Swedish NATO accession in Ankara. But Sweden is now saying that Turkey has promised this approval will finally come, quote, within weeks. I feel like we've kind of heard this before, but I wanted to get your thoughts on where you see things right now and what your kind of expectations are for how this is going to play out going forward.
That's right. I remember talking to a Biden administration official a couple months before people in Washington heard from Turkish government that approval of Sweden's NATO bid was going to happen soon. This Biden administration official said, "I'll believe it when I see it." We've heard that before. So there's a lot of skepticism in Washington, also in the Congress about that. I've always argued that at some point Erdogan is going to do it. Erdogan is gonna approve. Obviously, the person he is, he often comes to the negotiating table with huge maximalist demands. So his MO is he wants to, in any negotiation, he's gonna try to extract as many concessions as possible. And I found that very problematic, even from his own point of view. So that's exactly what happened. He wanted to use Sweden and Finland's accession process as this great trump card where he could get everything he wanted from Washington. And I think that was a mistake. It was obvious that it was not going to provide the results that Erdogan wanted. And it ended up angering a lot of people in the US Congress as well. Right after Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was this great opening in especially in the Congress, where many people who had been critical of Erdogan before were saying that, he's a problematic partner, but as this crisis has shown us, he's an important partner. We have to work with him. So we should sell F-16s to Turkey. But I think Erdogan's way of handling Sweden's accession into NATO has really alienated those members who were willing to give Erdogan more credit than they had before. So that's why we find ourselves in a very complicated situation right now where Erdogan promise, I mean, not promise, he always says that it's in the hands of the Turkish parliament right now. I think it will happen. But if he keeps dragging his feet, it's just going to undermine the very little goodwill that he managed to build among US policymakers here. But there are other issues attached to this. So even if he goes ahead and approves Sweden's NATO accession, Ben Cardin, for instance, Senator Menendez, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he's out of the picture now is the chair of the committee. Now we have a new chair. And there were a lot of expectations in Ankara that things were going to be radically different. Things were going to work out with this new chair. But it looks like, judging by his first remarks after taking on that position, the new chair also thinks that There are other outstanding issues that need to be resolved with Turkey before Congress goes ahead and approves that sale. So things are very complicated right now. And even if Turkey goes ahead and approves Sweden's NATO accession tomorrow, selling F 16s to Turkey is not going to be an easy decision.
As you alluded to, the kind of bilateral relationship is complicated and contentious, kind of same as it ever was, it seems. In addition to the situation in Gaza, the Sweden and F-16 approval issues, there are so many other items that Washington and Ankara are at odds over. Everything from the sort of long-standing U.S. ties to the Syrian Democratic Forces to this ongoing FBI investigation into New York Mayor Eric Adams over alleged fundraising violations linked to Turkey. What do you see as the other big kind of biggest issues on the bilateral agenda, biggest kind of pressure points?
Uh, the Black Sea right now we don't talk about what's happening in Ukraine as much, but right after Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the things that became very important in bilateral ties was Black Sea region. Right, the region became very important, and US and NATO pushed for a bigger presence, NATO presence in the Black Sea. And Turkey's line, and I would say that's been not just Erdogan's policy, but even before Erdogan came to power, Turkey always wanted to have its own say. It has viewed the Black Sea as a region, its backyard, and really wanted to limit Western presence there. But from Washington's point of view, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that position became very problematic, especially after the Russian Navy's blockade of Ukrainian forces, which was threatening naval traffic there. There was a lot of anxiety in Washington with regards to what Russia might do next in the Black Sea and how NATO should respond. So there was a lot of pressure on the Turkish government to allow more NATO presence there. And the Turkish official line was that we don't want to provoke Russia more. I don't think that this administration or the administration before has a clear Black Sea policy. But I think it's in the making now. More and more people I hear in the administration are talking about devising a Black Sea policy. So if Washington ends up having a clear priorities and the roadmap there, then that region is going to be an important agenda item in bilateral ties. And also, it's somewhat forgotten now, but also South Caucasus is one area where we can talk about both conflicting and overlapping US and Turkish interests there. There were just a few weeks ago, we were talking about a potential Azerbaijani invasion of southern Armenia, for example. And in such a scenario, obviously, Turkey will back Azerbaijan as it has done so for many years now. But that is not that Biden administration is paying close attention to that part of the world, but it should. In that case, I think that region also becomes another agenda item. And of course, from Biden administration's point of view, China is the big thing in their foreign policy vision, and what Turkey might do with China should be interesting to US policymakers. For many years, Erdogan called China a strategic partner, and there was even a time, I think back in 2013, when Turkey entertained the idea of purchasing Chinese defense missile. Ankara ended up dropping that idea after pressure from the West. But that kind of partnership, what that partnership might evolve into, should be a concern for Washington. Until now, it has become largely a trade partnership. Turkey really wants China to invest in Turkey. Turkey wants to be part of this BRI initiative of China. And also, something interesting, and I'll end it with this, an interesting region to look at is Africa from bilateral point of view. Africa is a region where the US should be paying close attention to because you have Russia there, you have China there, you have this coup belt in sub-Saharan Africa where there's a lot of activity from Russians, from Chinese, and Turkey is an important player there as well. And the US should be paying close attention to what others are doing there. And it could be a region where the US and Turkey could collaborate.
Excellent point there. I think we forget about Turkey's role in Africa and Washington quite often. We're running short on time, Gönül, but before we wrap up, I want to get your outlook on Turkey for 2024. How do you see things playing out moving forward, and what are the key issues you'll be watching over the next few months?
Well, from the last elections, I learned my lesson, Alistair. It's really Turkish politics is it can change and usually defies expectations of especially scholars like myself who live in Western capitals. So that's why I hesitate to talk about what might happen in a few months in local elections. But on the other hand, I think I can safely say that what might happen in big cities that really matter in Istanbul and Ankara it will depend on what these two leaders of the CHP and leaders of Good Party decide to do. If they decide to field separate candidates, I think it's going to be very difficult for the opposition to keep its hold on these cities. Should they decide to move forward with another electoral alliance in those big cities, I am optimistic that the opposition will hold those cities. And from then on, I think then the big question becomes in terms of the future of Turkish democracy, what Özgür Özel will do with his party and with the power that he has. What will be his policies on the most pressing problems of the country, including the Kurdish question? Those things will say a lot about where Erdogan's competitive authoritarian regime might evolve in the years to come.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Gönül, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Alistair.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to Elliot Sanders, our producer, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can find our latest coverage of Turkey and details about MEI's upcoming Turkey conference on December 6th on our website at www.mei.edu. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.